Hello, everyone. This is our final lecture for the semester. This is going to be on the RedforEd movement, teachers' unions and teacher strikes more generally. But it's going to contribute to part of a wider discussion on the future of the American labor movement that we're going to have at the start of class on December 7th, right? And so this lecture, in a lot of ways, which is going to be shorter than some of our earlier lectures, is really just going to serve as a primer to that class discussion, as well as kind of like a general course recap of where the labor movement is going, where do we think it's going, what kinds of questions is the labor movement going to have to negotiate in the future. The questions that I'm going to pose at the end of this lecture are not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of myriad intersecting challenges facing not only the American labor movement, but the global labor movement today. But this is just a foot dabbling in the water of what we think prospectively the labor movement might be coming to terms with as we get kind of further into the 21st century. Of course, per the usual, I'm always going to offer some suggested readings for folks who are interested. These two are pretty much on topic, pretty much related, but in a lot of ways they diverge from each other a great deal. John Shelton's Teacher Strike, Public Education, the Making of a New American Political Order takes a close examination of how teacher strikes in the 1960s and 1970s and their adherence to kind of this industrial unionist approach to organizing really comes around. And in a lot of ways, it serves to bite these teacher unions in the back, so to speak, right? This is because of a lot of different reasons that we're going to be able to cover in the actual lecture. But as we kind of approach these topics, especially when we talk about the Ocean Hill teacher strikes in New York City in 1968, that if that topic is interesting to you, I would strongly recommend Shelton's book. I've been able to read it for actually 2 classes, and it's strong scholarship. It's very forward-thinking and insightful. Definitely recommended. The other, of course, is Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. This one is going to be perhaps a little less specific to labor history, but still kind of lumped in with this wider idea of working class history. It doesn't necessarily tackle the issue of unions, but it does look at how the existing political order tends to take instances of duress, of social tension, and of kind of these unforeseen challenges by the general public, at least, and turn them into opportunities for pressing privatization and austerity measures, kind of cutting back against these publicly funded institutions that kind of came with the rise of the New Deal coalition all the way back in the 1930s. Specifically, if you don't get a chance to read the entire book, I definitely recommend reading, at the very, very least, the introduction, because Naomi Klein does an excellent job kind of kicking the reader off, so to speak, with a pretty good summary of what disaster capitalism is and what the shock doctrine is, and how not only has it been applied in the past through these various neo-colonial, arguably imperialist projects like in Pinochet's Chile, but also how they are now being imposed today in the United States, for example, in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. What happened to the public education system there? What happened to these publicly funded institutions in the wake of these disasters? Perhaps specifically prescient as we continue to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, they are coming out. They've announced very promising trials with these 2 different vaccines from these different companies that range from 90 to 95%, or some even higher rates of effectiveness. So maybe we're seeing the tail end of this thing, but as we kind of navigate COVID-19 and its potential closure, how does the shock doctrine, how does disaster capitalism, how are these forces going to play out in the near future? Definitely also a strong read. I've also gotten the opportunity to read this one, and I highly recommend it. This lecture is essentially, the bulk of it is going to be about teachers' unions, right? We're going to have this discussion at the end, or leading into this discussion for the 7th, about how about what recent lessons in labor union history and labor organizing, what kind of lessons affect and what we can draw on them in our gauge of how labor is going to progress in the 21st century. But teachers unions themselves, there's not like one teachers union, right? In a lot of industrial unions, you have the United Auto Workers, and there's not really a sizable counterpart to the UAW, at least in the United States. If you go into Canada, there's Unifor, I suppose, but they're not just auto workers. Same thing with the steel workers, the mine workers. The Western Federation of Miners is not a robust counterpart to the United Mine Workers today, for example, right? But in the teaching industry, there are two. The National Education Association was founded all the way back in 1857. It's the first educational union, so to speak, but it's worth pointing out that in 1857, when the NEA was first founded, it did not actually serve primarily as a representative for teaching and educational staff. It was more an association for different school districts in small towns and rural communities. It kind of served as their national representative for the interests of school districts. Because of that, the NEA has always taken a more inclusive stance towards allowing supervisors, right? People who oversee educational staff and teachers. It's allowed them membership and participation in the organization. The NEA really doesn't start to shift to represent teachers in a more exclusive kind of labor union tone or stance on things until after its first 100 years of history. In 1957, it starts to pivot a little bit and starts to represent teachers' interests in a more kind of direct. And I don't want to go out so far as to say that the NEA becomes militant in 1957, but they definitely become more of a labor union and less of an organization or an association, so to speak. Its competing organization, competing may be too strong of terminology, but its friendly rival, the American Federation of Teachers, is more recent. It's a little over 100 years old, about 104 years old. And it was founded in Chicago in 1916. It was done so with the expressed interest of representing the concerns of teachers and educational staff, and not of folks like district administrators or supervisors. So these are the main two. There are also independent education associations, and there's also local only teacher unions. These are abbreviated as IEAs and LOTUs. They're relatively obscure, and they're pretty small in comparison to these larger national organizations, but they are also out there. A lot of times when we talk about the labor movement, when we talk about the AFL-CIO, and sometimes we lump in Change to Win, as well as this kind of competing but smaller labor federation, we tend to just look at the labor movement as this labor federation, right? There's the AFL-CIO, and that's about it. But there's actually a lot of independent and small local or county or tri-county sized organizations that are outside of the purview of these organizations. The NEA, for example, is largely outside of the AFL-CIO, and I'm pretty sure it's also outside of Change to Win, but it has close to 3 million members, and it's actually, like, in terms of membership, the largest union in the United States. But when we talk about the labor movement, if we presume that we're talking about this labor federation, the AFL-CIO or Change to Win, we're leaving out these other independent unions like NEA or IEAs and LOTUs. So that's these are the different unions that are representing teachers. There's been a historical divide between these two organizations. They don't rise independently for a lack of reason. And the reason they are two separate organizations today kind of speaks to the issue where in education and in the labor movement, there are different tendencies in the ways people view labor organizations, right? Is a labor union a representative of members, or is it a wider working class advocacy organization that also bargains? So like we said, in 1957, the NEA kind of pivots after 100 years to focus more on representing teaching staff. The NEA, kind of in contrast to the American Federation of Teachers, is also It's tended to avoid public expressions of labor activism or militancy. Like we said, the NEA includes supervisors and remains an independent organization outside of these labor federations. And it, in terms of organizational character, it will usually try to refrain from strikes and other behavior that might be less palatable to a lot of communities that the NEA serves. And there's a reason for this. The NEA itself is somewhat of a rural organization. The NEA primarily represents, as we said, these rural communities and these small towns, the educational support staff, teachers, and the actual school districts in these communities. And when you kind of get out of these major urban areas and these larger cities, and these rural and small town communities, the population tends to be more conservative politically. And the labor movement itself, well, it's always kind of expressed itself as a wide kind of worker solidarity umbrella that's outside of politics. The labor movement itself is inherently political. And so the NEA, in order to kind of represent its members more effectively and ensure that its membership doesn't come into conflict with the communities it serves, it tends to be a little bit more muted in its labor activism and in its and in some of its dialogue. On the other hand, the AFT tends to be, or can be, more vocal in advocacy. It can take a much more progressive stance, and that's because the AFT is primarily an urban-based union. So for example, in the state of Michigan, the Detroit Federation of Teachers is a local of the American Federation of Teachers. The AAUP, which represents faculty on Wayne State's campus, or the GEOC or UPTF, representing part-time lecturers and graduate teaching assistants, they're all associated with the AFT. But if you get out to smaller communities in mid-Michigan or northern Michigan, some of these smaller towns, those teachers in general have a very high unionization rate, but those teachers are more than likely going to be affiliated with the NEA and not the AFT. Now, these characterizations can be a little bit problematic because the NEA, people who work with the NEA, organizers involved with the NEA, put in a lot of hours to make sure that the working conditions of their members are respected, that teachers have workplace dignity. And in conventional terms, the NEA is a union, right? It bargains for members, it negotiates contracts, it can file grievances, and on the rare occasion when a strike becomes so heavily demanded that it's palatable for rural communities that are largely conservative, it becomes palatable for the NEA to pursue, those strikes will happen. On the other hand, though, there have been consistent calls for these two teachers unions to merge, right? If you have the AFT, which has over 1 million members, and you have the NEA that has almost 3 million members, why don't these two very large unions just merge into one big super union, right? I actually tried to do this at the end of the 1990s, and then I believe again in the mid 2000s. There were propositions brought to these unions conventions, basically saying, "Hey, let's merge with this other union," and both times they failed. This is largely because members in the NEA went on record as saying that they viewed the NEA like a professional association and not like a union, right? Not like the AFT. The AFT is one of these militant organizations organizing workers in these big cities. And we're the NEA, we're the very small town kind of rural school districts. We don't really want to get involved in what some might characterize as abrasive politics. And so there is kind of a rank and file characterization of the NEA, not so much as a union, but more of as a professional association. And that's kept these two organizations apart. So that's it, right? We've covered all the history of teachers' unions, and now we can go home. No, not exactly. Teachers' unions in the 1950s, especially after public sector bargaining starts to gain wider and wider approval, teachers' unions start to make a lot of ground. In the 1960s, going into the mid-1960s, toward the ends of the 1960s, teacher unionization rates, where they are not already high, really just skyrocket, and that accompanies this wider trend in public sector union growth. But the thing about teachers' unions, or the thing about teaching itself as a profession, is that you're very much tied to a community that you're working at, and what happens in these communities invariably is going to affect your working conditions and your jobs, right? The kind of situations, the kind of conditions that you work under. At the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, as a lot of these major cities in the United States started to suburbanize, the suburbs started to grow and extend even further and further away from these urban cores. Right, we have jobs leaving cities like Detroit and relocating to further outside of the city. Call this capital flight, and there's a predominantly white migration out of urban areas that we know as white flight, kind of de facto reinforcing racial spatial segregation. We can see this happening in Detroit. It's also happening at the top there. You can see like the redlining map that's going on in the 1940s and 1950s, reinforcing these spatial boundaries. We've, of course, talked about this in class. This is happening in cities all across the country, right? You can see down at the bottom right, racial segregation in New York, very akin to racial segregation in Detroit, is very much easy to map out. And there are some very clear boundaries that can be demarcated quite effectively on some of these maps here. When we talk about teaching, right, when we talk about suburbanization and its effects on teaching, we have to acknowledge the fact that as capital flight and white flight start to empty these major cities that teachers have kind of built a strong base in, as they start to empty out of these urban areas, schools are facing substantial budget shortfalls, right? There's lower tax revenues, there's lower incomes for cities, and this means that less money, less funds, less funding is making its way to these cities' educational systems. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that teachers have fewer students to teach, right? In Detroit, it's certainly the case. The population as a whole in the city starts to decline, not even in 1967 when the famous Detroit Rebellion breaks out, but much earlier in the mid-1950s, you have people starting to leave the city, back when it had close to 2 million people in it. But in a lot of other cities, right, these populations don't just drop off so sharply. What ends up actually happening is that as suburbanization gains traction and people start to leave cities and they start to buy homes in these predominantly white suburbs, the people who are left behind in these urban areas, because of these policies of redlining, because of these policies of racialized segregation in housing, these houses that are made available are not made accessible to the people who live in these communities, but they are accessible to people who, for example, can buy housing on speculation and rent out housing. This means that teachers might be responsible for instructing the same number of children, right? Your class size is still going to be 30 students, but because fewer of those students come from families where their parents are paying property taxes, which by and large, right, we don't want to speak in too much generalizations, but by and large, property taxes are used to fund things like transit and education. Because families are forced to rent because mortgages, things like this are inaccessible because of redlining, even though the student population remains largely consistent in a lot of cities, teachers have to do with less and less. Now, stressors like these are felt all across major cities in the United States at this time. There is a famous Detroit teachers strike at the end of the 1960s. Same with Chicago, Philadelphia. There are cities all across not only the Rust Belt, but in many parts of the country that are going through a wave of teacher strikes as teachers really try to put pressure on city governments to maintain adequate levels of funding for the jobs that they have to do. In New York City, teacher strikes also serve to widen racial divides. in some of these already very segregated communities, and specifically in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and the Ocean Hill, Brownsville neighborhoods of Brooklyn in 1968. African-American activists, self-determination advocates, community control, organizers win a pretty big battle. They're given, they create a new school district in the Ocean Hill, Brownsville neighborhood. And one of the first steps that they take, these organizers, is they transfer the predominantly white teaching staff out of the district. Right? They're not necessarily fired, but they're told you can't teach in this school district. There are not enough teachers of color teaching our kids their own history. Predominantly Black culture is being left out of school curriculums, and we want to change that. And so we're going to transfer you elsewhere. This, of course, you can understand rubs teachers the wrong way, especially if they've been teaching in a community for 15, 20 years, right? They have very much carved out a home and a life there. They might have their own house. I suppose in New York City, it might not be a house. It might be not an apartment, but like a condominium or a flat. There are a lot of different ways that one can buy housing, but we're getting beside the point. That a lot of these teachers have roots in the community. And when they're suddenly being told, okay, well, you have to now go somewhere else, what this does is it really puts teachers and the interests of teachers and the interests of the wider labor movement, this idea of universal workers' rights, into direct conflict with calls for self-determination, of community control, and of the rights of people to have a say over the educational standards that their children are participating in, right? So the largely white Jewish educational staff accuses these community control advocates of anti-Semitism. Community control advocates are really turn around and can just as easily accuse these teachers of being anti-Black and racist. This leads to a deadlock. The United Federation of Teachers in New York City, which is a local of the AFT, wages a 2-month-long strike in order to reverse this transfer process, right? To make sure that these teachers are able to keep their jobs. And ultimately, it's only because leading civil rights advocates like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who you see standing to the right of then AFT president, really intervene and try and find an amicable solution to the situation. What ends up happening is that these teachers, really against the desires of these community control activists, are kept in their positions. A. Philip Randolph, of course, would make the argument that if Black community control advocates can transfer white teachers out of their jurisdiction, who's to say that that suburban, predominantly white communities can't do the same to Black educators? In fact, this happens pretty often. Black educators in predominantly white communities are more often than not subject to harassment and discrimination, especially when you compare them, their experiences to their white coworkers. But you don't want to set a legal precedent, right? De facto is one thing, de jure is another. So here you're seeing community self-determination and universal rights of workers kind of being on oppositional teams here. And this is kind of part of the wider this is part of the characterization that really explains the wider breakup of the New Deal coalition, right? Going into the 1960s and into the 1970s, there is a discrepancy between newfound calls for dignity with respect to identity politics and this idea of cross-racial, gender, sex, nationality, worker-based solidarity. Additionally, these teachers' 2-month-long strikes infuriates a lot of people in the community. It's worth saying that if you are a working parent, as I'm positive most people in New York were at the time, you don't really have the resources to just leave your job for 2 months and starting to homeschool your children just because teachers go on strike. That's a pretty big, not only time, personal commitment stressor that you are suddenly putting on parents of all of these students, but additionally, it's a financial burden, right? If a family is living paycheck to paycheck and suddenly their income is reduced by half because one of the parents has to stay home, or you have to start paying for childcare because it's about the same price, there's a lot of resentment there. So even outside of Ocean Hill, Brownsville, these neighborhoods in Brooklyn, similar strikes throughout these major American cities in the late 60s and 70s kind of combine with the economic downturn that accompanies things like the oil embargo, deindustrialization and the effects that come with that. As we get further into the 1970s and you see things like stagflation occurring, where there is inflation and the dollar is being devalued, but at the same time, you're also seeing negative job growth, kind of breaking this older system of Keynesian economics. It just ends up being too much for a lot of working class families who are suddenly kind of put in, not necessarily because they want to, right? But situations being as they are, put them in an oppositional role to the demands of teachers. After the 1970s, you're going to see a lot of discourse come out where teachers' unions, teachers themselves, but additionally, really the wider labor movement, but specifically aimed at teachers. A lot of times, they're a pretty prominent punching bag for anti-labor advocates, opponents of the labor movement. They're able to characterize teachers' unions as entitled, stagnant, uncaring, self-serving. These kinds of characterizations of teachers' unions start to rise to national prominence, and they're going to be really the mainstay of discourse around the educational system until the 1990s. You know, the teachers care more about tenure and their paycheck than they do about kids. Kind of divorces you from the fact that the teacher's paycheck allows them to buy supplies for a classroom when funding, other educational funding dries up, right? A lot of times teachers will fall back on their own paycheck in order to make sure that students coming to class have food and supplies. So a decade earlier, unionization, was quickly expanding into the realm of the public sector and a lot of other unorganizable industries that traditionally overlapped with what we know as pink collar labor, right? Teachers fall under pink collar labor, even though for a very long time they've had their own labor organizations. And at the end of the New Deal coalition, increasingly cases are made against unionization, against teachers' unions, against the right to organize. These cases are being made under the premise that unionization is at odds with the public welfare, right? The economy isn't looking too hot right now, but look at these teachers want another raise. They want another 2% raise. Don't you taxpayers pay enough? This, of course, ignores the fact of how much are corporations paying in taxes. What's the top marginal income tax? What's the estate tax? All these other sources of fundings that have been gutted over the last X amount of years. Some handy political cartoons on the left just to kind of demonstrate the point here. So as we said, public attitudes towards teachers' unions are kind of cemented as really oppositional, if not openly hostile, for the next couple of decades. And this contributes to the reluctance on the part of some organizations to take a stronger stand against austerity cuts and other financial reforms that can arguably harm public education's the public educational system, right? And this isn't just teachers, but students also. So when the federal government or when the state government approaches a local community, right, or when the federal government approaches the state government and says, hey, we actually, we passed a bunch of tax cuts and we need to make room in the budget for them, for the trickle-down economic growth that is sure to follow, we need to make budget cuts now. A lot of times this is coming right out of the educational system. Or if it's not coming out of the educational system, it's coming from other what Some might refer to as social entitlements, other might refer to as public welfare programs. As we finish reading Neuberger for the end of class, you'll increasingly come to find that language and how language is phrased can either weaponize or advocate different organizations and groups and their interests. A good example of this kind of anti-teacher bias, in 2012, there was a film called Won't Back Down. It takes place in the city of Pittsburgh, which is one of these northeastern Rust Belt cities, of course. And it portrays, it takes a public school and it portrays teachers' unions as the sole cause for why students in these inner city schools are not succeeding, right? The teachers don't care. The teachers just show up to a paycheck. The teachers aren't attentive enough to the students. This really upset both the AFT and the NEA, of course, because it completely glossed over the fact that as time has gone on, teachers have found themselves with increased class sizes, right? It's not 24, it's 28 this year. It's not 28 this year, it's 32 this year. Oh, it's actually 40 because the seminar class. So worsening conditions faced by teachers, these things are completely glossed over. The fact that teacher pay had kind of stagnated after 2008, didn't really start to go up again until about another decade later, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the AFT and the NEA cried foul. They argued some very warranted criticism of the film. Of course, that criticism was responded to by political cartoons like this one. Now, a lot of times, these characterizations of teachers' unions as a bad thing coincided with a wider argument that public education itself was failing, right? These are the same kinds of arguments that were levied against public housing in the 1950s and 1960s, right? You take away all the funding for a public institution through tax cuts, through budget cuts, through reduction of funds, through the moving around of offices that kind of tie up the flows of incomes that a agency or an organization working with the government might need to access, generally slowing down the process and defunding it. Like I said, this happens to public housing. So you defund an organization and then you point at how it's not doing its proper job. You argue for it to be shut down and privatized, and that eventually happens. Similar situation going on with the public school, the public education system in some states, not every state, but increasingly there are calls being made to kind of privatize the educational system and to turn the educational system over to the private market as the more efficient way to handle a public service or a public utility like education, right? Now, admittedly, in some instances, charter schools offer students greater success rates. That's a positive. Teachers who are employed at charter schools applaud the fact that they're given they're given greater flexibility and ownership of their classes when they work for these kinds of charter schools, right? The administration can be a little more hands-off. Give teachers the ability to really teach what they feel their students need to know. So here the charter schools, by given this amount of freedom, they're able to succeed in some instances, right? But this comes off with a lot of negatives. Charter school workers are routinely overworked and underpaid and enjoy fewer employment protections than most of their public school counterparts, for example. And both quantitative and qualitative data continues to suggest that schools are still struggling because of a lack of funds and a mismanagement of existing funds, not necessarily because the teachers are just lazy. Charter schools, by the charter school association's own admittance, while charter schools perform better than public schools in a lot of instances, public schools are on average more consistent and fail less often than charter schools, because charter schools as a private organization, as a for-profit organization instead of a nonprofit public utility, as a for-profit organization, they really need to make money in order to continue to operate. And so this means that certain cuts need to be made, that certain programs aren't offered. Private market, of course, is always a little bit more volatile than the public market. And so US charter schools close on average about 8 times more often than public schools. Most often this is for financial reasons, right? School ends up running out of money, it has to close. So even when charter schools are doing perhaps a little bit better than public schools, this comes with the drawback that if your child goes to a charter school, there's a much greater likelihood that their instruction is going to be interrupted in the middle of the semester or in the middle of the year, and you're going to have to find a new school for them. This, of course, isn't necessarily great for their education. So a lot of times charter schools are being touted as this preferable alternative to public schools. And while it's certainly to be said that the charter schools might have their benefits, completely replacing the entire public educational system for a free market alternative is something that the teachers unions largely oppose, and that's for a number of reasons, really. Most recently, we've actually had a pretty intense education workers strike wave in 2018 and 2019 across a number of different states. Publicly employed teachers began walking out on strike. This was not only the AFT, but the NEA as well. After the 2008 recession, there's a lot of pressure to limit not only the federal, but state and local budgets as well. The federal debt, of course, continues to kind of increase. Depending on who you ask, that's for any number of reasons, like, are the rich not paying their share? Are we paying too much in public entitlements like Medicare and Medicaid? Regardless, though, in the midst of the 2008 recession, there's a lot of pressure to kind of freeze budgets, to keep public spending at an absolute minimum. And because of this, over the next 10 years, the majority of public educators do not see a sizable increase in their pay. Sizable, of course, it depends on who you ask, but it's a consistent enough of a problem that in 2018, about 10 years later, when new budgets are put forward that keep teacher pay set at 2008, 2009 levels, these budgets come forward, of course, after political elections, when governors, state representatives, senators, and whatnot all promise that they're going to be allocating greater funds for education. This ultimately doesn't happen. Teachers in some of the most conservative and rural states ultimately take the initiative to begin pretty massive walkouts. And this is the beginning of the education worker strike wave. It's also known as the RedforEd strikes. This is because coordinators of these strikes use the hashtag RedforEd to work with each other to share information. I believe the first strike took place in Oklahoma. This was quickly followed by West Virginia and Arizona, North Carolina and Virginia, Georgia, Kentucky, Colorado and California were soon to follow. And the majority of these strikes are actually pretty effective. They force these state and local governments to turn around and revise their budgets and promise pay increases to a lot of these teachers who hadn't seen a pay increase, hadn't seen any sort of cost of living adjustment, hadn't seen any increase in increases in their educational funding for their classrooms. They hadn't seen these in a number of years. What made the majority of these strikes successful? It's worth asking, right? The strike wave itself broke a number of conventional assumptions that accompany teachers' unions. These ideas that teachers' unions were self-serving, that they were a closed-off industry, and that their interests were against the communities they lived in. If you look at the map here, most of these successful strikes are taking place, with the exception of West Virginia and arguably Kentucky, if you consider Kentucky to be part of the Rust Belt. Most of these states are actually in the Sun Belt. They're not in this industrial Northeast that's kind of often associated with the labor movement and labor militancy. Now, in contrast to some of these industry-specific campaigns, teachers in the 2018 and 2019 RedforEd campaigns actively worked to reach out to parents and caregivers, community organizations, and other activist groups to build coalitional support for the strike, right? It wasn't enough that teachers could vote to go on strike, that they could announce a strike, and that they just weren't going to come into work. When that happens in the 1960s and 1970s, it really backfires on the teachers and teachers' unions, teachers themselves, and a lot of schools suffer as a result, because these schools are put in immediate conflict with the communities they serve. In 2018 and 2019, teachers' unions learned from this. They reach out to other unions, right? So on the bottom right there, even though this is a pro-teacher march, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union is there in Colorado supporting them. You also have a lot of people in the community. You have students and parents supporting the teacher strike. So because teachers take into consideration through this kind of outreach, they're informed of what the community needs, right? All right, if you are going to close school, if you are going to go on strike, I think that's a good idea. I think teachers aren't paid enough, and the amount of funds that are being allocated to my children in schools aren't enough. But at the same time, I have to go to work. So is it possible to arrange daycare for my kids? Is it possible to make sure that if my child is dependent on school provided lunch and breakfast, that they're still going to get those meals? And by taking the concerns of the community into consideration, these strikes see much greater mass support and much greater success. In the state of West Virginia, for example, the governor at the time, Jim Justice, I'm not sure if he's still the governor, he actually tries to not only keep teacher pay frozen, he tries to decrease it somewhat, and he tries to fold in teacher healthcare into a private organization that's not going to be covered by the state. You have to pay for your own healthcare now, sort of a rebate system called PARA. Public support for teachers is so strong in West Virginia that Jim Justice is forced to agree to a 5% pay raise and this controversial healthcare plan that also would have been incredibly invasive, right? PARA was telling teachers, like, you have to submit to routine body screenings and these sorts of things if you want to have healthcare. That was dropped. The next year, when the West Virginia state legislature turned around and tried to introduce and pass a number of proposals that would have limited the power of teachers' unions, things like actually criminalizing public employee striking. A public employee strike might be illegal, and a government can issue an injunction to stop a strike. It can fire public employees who are striking if public sector strikes are illegal, but actively criminalizing it means that, okay, well, now if you're on that picket line, we're going to load you into the paddy wagon and take you downtown. So attempts to criminalize public employee striking, attempts to completely turn over public education to private charter schools. When these initiatives were brought forward, that broad coalitional support was still there, and teachers were again in 2019, the next year in West Virginia, were able to rally their supporters and press the government to reject this legislation. By taking this approach, teachers' unions actually kind of demonstrate a rejection of a lot of the traditional institutional approaches to striking and organizing. There has been, as we have seen throughout the second half of this semester, there's been a strong undercurrent after Taft-Hartley, after the purges of the CIO, and after its merger with the AFL. There's been this strong current in the labor movement to represent the interests of labor union members, right? Sometimes called bread and butter unionism or business unionism, this idea that union membership is a commodity that you're selling to members and that your only responsibility is to your members to get them the best contract possible. That approach, well, it might be a good strategy in some short-term situations, can really serve to alienate communities. And so when teachers' unions take this more community-based approach to organizing that a lot of labor organizations have kind of left behind, right? It doesn't really fit into the Wagner Act NLRB style of labor organizing and arbitration. But by taking advantage of these community-based approaches, we can see greater rates of success. And this is also true, of course, if you're following along with Neuberger's lettuce wars. The UFW is incredibly successful here, right? Not only are they fighting growers, corrupt sheriffs, La Migra La Border Patrol, they're also fighting the Teamsters, which isn't even the AFL-CIO at this time. They leave and have their own issues going on at the time. UFW wins similar victories by reaching out to the community, by engaging with people not directly involved in farm work. So this provides us with a couple of questions for the future of the labor movement, doesn't it? So again, I have a couple of questions here, and again, this lecture is somewhat short, but I have a couple of questions to keep in mind for our end of semester discussion that we're having on the 7th. First, are community-based approaches to unionization making a comeback? If they're proving more effective, what does this say about the traditional bargaining process that was formalized under the Wagner Act? There are a couple of labor historians who have written in the past who have argued that the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board, these kinds of legislative regimes that serve to formalize the labor movement, is maybe not within the halls of government, but kind of attached to it through these government overseen boards. They're actually a negative thing for labor, because these sorts of institutions rein in and restrict what a labor movement can do, what a labor union can do, right? The UFW is able to call for a boycott because it's not recognized as the representative of the workers. And teachers are able to engage in public strikes because if you can effectively canvass a community you serve in and win their popular support, it's kind of hard to end that strike. Should unions principally serve their members, or should they advocate for the working class as a whole? This recurring division between advocates of business unionism, of bread and butter unionism, and advocates of social unionism, social movement unionism sometimes. What direction should the labor movement go in? Speaks to a wider question of what constitutes a union issue, right? A lot of times we have people studying the labor movement, folks in the labor movement, who will look at a political issue and say, that's not a labor movement issue. What marks that boundary? Or is there actually a boundary at all? Are all political issues inherently labor union issues if a labor union represents all workers? And what is the goal of the labor movement today, right? 100 years ago, and this kind of speaks to the readings that we're doing in Neuberger's Lettuce Wars too, but 100 years ago, the AFL in the 1920s abandons its critique of the capitalist system and starts to advocate for a fair day's work for a fair day's pay as the axiom that they repeat over and over. More radical organizations like the IWW and more left-leaning organizations within the CIO are they don't agree with this stance, right? They kind of, they critique this axiom. But ultimately that kind of criticism doesn't win out, right? The AFL-CIO today is the AFL-CIO. The IWW has about 5,000 members in the US. But given these rapid technological advances in productive capabilities and automation, is a fair day's work for a fair day's pay still an achievable goal? with so much of production and labor automated and requiring much fewer man hours to provide everyone with food and shelter and housing, does the labor movement's goals need to change? Neuberger would probably say yes. Others would certainly say no. Keep these questions in mind as we get closer to our final class discussion. I'm not going to say that there is a clear-cut answer. I don't think there is. But I'm interested to hear everyone's thoughts in class. So looking forward to next class, make sure that you're preparing your research presentations, right? We're going to be presenting our term paper topics, giving a brief rundown of the strike that we're covering, who was involved, when it happened, over what, how was it resolved, why is it historically significant, also sharing kind of the how of the research process, right? What challenges did you encounter, what specific findings were really surprising or rewarding to you. And keep in mind those term papers are due promptly Monday night, 11:59 p.m. midnight. So if I say Monday at midnight, I'm not saying 12 a.m. At the end of the day Sunday, I'm saying at the end of the day Monday. Make sure that those are submitted through Canvas. I'm looking forward to next class with you. It's been a very rewarding semester. And I know I've learned a lot. I hope you've all learned a lot. You've certainly demonstrated a lot of commitment and dedication to this course. And so I'm looking forward to our next class together.